Here we go again. This is a brief video that will explain the things you need to know for the first exam on the first 3 chapters. Number 1, this is also available, this particular key, on the online site in the schedule next to something that you should have been trying to work on yourselves. But now if you're having problems with that, this will explain the answers as well. A formal political arrangement by which a land and its people are ruled is called a government. A single individual ruler can be called a dictator or a autocrat. In democratic governments, the people rule, or the many rule. If a small group controls the governing decisions, that form of government can be called oligarchy. If formal and effective limits are placed on the powers of government, it can be called a constitutional or limited government. The classic definition of politics is the struggle over who gets what, where, and how. An example of a public good is clean air. Coercion and revenue collection have historically been part of government's ideas of law and order. In order for the government to exist, it needs personnel. You got to pay the personnel. How are you going to get the money to do that? You're going to have some form of revenue or tax collection. The influential sectors in colonial American politics, as we identified earlier, are New England merchants, so planters, small farmers, shopkeepers, and the other one was Tories, or the Loyalists. Limiting the powers of the central government was the main concern of the founders. That was part of the arguments between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists were concerned about creating a strong central government again after fighting the American Revolution against the supposed injustices of King George III. Shays' Rebellion was an attempt to prevent foreclosure on farm mortgages in Springfield, Massachusetts. It came to symbolize the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Thomas Jefferson was one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence. He actually wrote it out. There was a committee that worked on that, but he's generally considered to be the main author because he wrote it. Equal representation is part of the New Jersey Plan. Please remember this. Publius was the writer. That was the pseudonym that Madison, Hamilton, and Jay used when they signed the end of the essay, when it was published in newspapers around the country. Brutus was used by the Anti-Federalists in their essays. Clearer and more restrictive boundaries on the federal government were reasons for the adoption of the Bill of Rights. It is protections against the national government. And as we'll see in Chapter 4, eventually the Bill of Rights will be expanded everywhere in American society, not just against the actions of the national government. In order for Congress to send an amendment to the Constitution to the state legislatures or ratifying conventions, it must pass in both houses of Congress by a 2/3 vote. Implicit in the idea that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land means that federalism over time has seen a greater centralization of power. And especially since the New Deal, the federal government has become the more powerful level of government in American society. Federalist number 51 promotes the idea of the separation of powers and checks and balances. Ambition must be made to counter ambition. The Supremacy Clause is enunciated in Article 7. I think I might have misspoke on an earlier video, but this is clarifying that now. It's in Article 6, not 7, excuse me, I didn't misspeak. It was right, I said it right. Yeah, supremacy is in 6. 7 was ratification. Judicial review is the power of the courts to determine constitutionality. The necessary and proper clause is one of the most brilliant things the founders put into the original Constitution. This is the constitutional justification for changing the Constitution. Why? Because it allows for things that are not necessarily written down in the document to be implemented. In order to create a sound national currency, Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, created the National Bank. Obviously, you're going to have a sound banking system if you're going to have sound currencies. And many of the states' rights people objected to this because there's nothing in the original Constitution that says there should be a national bank, and they opposed that. And they'll argue about that right through 1913, when the final federal system that we still have today, Federal Reserve System, was implemented. The elastic clause is sometimes the nickname of the necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 8. The division of power into two or more levels is called federalism. We've talked about that. Implied powers are what are derived from the necessary and proper clause. Just because it's not there doesn't mean we can't do it. In the future, we might have to meet some sort of situation. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So if the national government has to raise an army in times of crisis, it has a right to do that. The full faith and credit clause is part of Article 4. States must respect laws and decisions of other states. The supremacy clause was affirmed by the court case of McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. McCulloch was the director of the bank. He refused to pay the tax that the state of Maryland was imposing on the national bank. Chief Justice Marshall said the power to tax is the power to destroy. That is unconstitutional. Banks were a necessary and proper part of creating a sound national currency. And he struck down Maryland's attempt to tax the national bank, but eventually President Jackson in the late 1820s and earlier 1830s will end up getting rid of the national bank. And then he's not affected by that. He ruins his successor, Martin Van Buren, and the Panic of 1837 will ruin Van Buren's presidency. It's one of the big recessions in American economic history, mainly because of the rapid inflation that took place in currency, with way too many loans being made by state banks and with no national authority controlling the issuing of all these different loans. Opposition to centralization and increasing national power is expressed through the idea of states' rights, which periodically comes back into play in American history to this day. The idea that the federal government is too powerful, that it's acting unconstitutionally because it's not in the proper sphere, that this is more properly addressed by the states or the localities. It's a never-ending argument. Dual or two sovereigns is found in the citizenship clause. You are an American citizen, and you are also a citizen of the state that you reside in. New federalism advocates were Nixon and Reagan. Veto power, approval of appointments, judicial review, or impeachment powers are all examples of checks and balances, and cooperative federalism has existed since the New Deal. Good luck on the exam. Please study this document carefully, and you will have no problems on this first exam.